But if I could ask the panelists to come up front and for our audience to take their seats so we can get started with our second panel.
Allison Medlock. Nice to meet you.
Hey, awesome.
Hey, it's that good.
So good afternoon, and we're on to the second part of this afternoon's session. This one is focusing on emerging applications and devices and the infrastructure to support them. We'll talk a little bit more on the infrastructure side. As Brian said earlier, it was kind of difficult as we went through this in distinguishing between current and emerging or future. I think the lines blur, and feel free to talk about what's going on now as well as the vision that you see in the future. We've just had one change in the panelists. Brian unfortunately wasn't able to stay for the second part. He had a travel commitment to make, and we've got Allison Medlock, who's joined us from the Media Bureau. And with that, I think we'll just go ahead and dive right in. We will have, this time I'll announce it at the start, somebody over here to take questions from the audience as we go through, and from the web as well. So, Sunil?
Great. My name is Sunil Dolavoy. I'm in New Business Development at Google, and first of all, I'd like to thank the Broadband Task Force for inviting me back here at the FCC. It's been about almost 10 years since I left the commission, and it's amazing. It's amazing how some things have not changed, and some of the debates in this town are still the same, but under a different name. But also, what I find quite amazing is the things that have changed in about just a short 2 years since my company has advocated openness and the commission adopted it in the 700 megahertz. The amount of devices and applications we're seeing is truly astounding. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. And from where I sit in new business development, my job at the company, to give you a quick background, is to do deals to help build the company's new products. That involves technology, licensing deals, content licensing deals, and strategic partnerships. So I come with that background today to give you a perspective from the Valley, from where I sit, not to advocate any particular regulatory model or review. I'll leave that to the policy team to do that. And from that vantage point, what I'm seeing from the application side is quite impressive. We have now such a tremendous amount of data. What I think is incredible is you're seeing a set of applications to help us manage and use all this data. And I think that's important for us to take into account. Whether it be just information as power concept, for instance, like flu trends, understanding when outbreak of flus that are occurring, applications that help us manage that. Power meters to help individuals understand how much their power consumption is and to change it accordingly too. But it isn't just education. Some of this information and applications that are taking advantage of it are just help us deal with everyday problems. A company like Howcast to help us visually learn how to change a tire, or how to cook fish, for example. Another company like BillShrink, again, help us manage how to pick the right cell phone carrier, device, and cell phone plan. Now, all these applications are incredibly useful, incredibly powerful. Most of them are free. And what they've done is take advantage of a tremendous amount of data that's already out there and make it manageable, make it useful for people to use. But it isn't just about consumption, too. I think what we'll see is a number of applications that are just about also creation. Now, with any phone, you can take a picture and you can upload it to your web album, and you can also take a video at the same time and upload to your YouTube homepage. The idea that we're not just passive consumers, but active creators is also a very compelling trend that we're seeing where I sit at Google. And the variety of this stuff is partly due to the fact there's some common standardizations and platforms that are occurring. In the case of smart devices, whether it be the iPhone App Store, the Android, the BlackBerry, or Palm, they're all providing developers a sense of common platform to develop and lowers their cost of development. And just the last short period of time, the last time I checked, we have over 1.5 billion apps downloaded from the iPhone App Store, and 65,000 of them are third-party apps. And these applications allow for what in other sense is augmented reality. What I mean by that is, you have eyes, which are on the cameras. You have basically ears, which are your microphones, and skin, which is your touch screens. And you also know your location. So with all these different sensories combined, what these devices can do is quite interesting. I mean, you can basically, with an application like OpenTable, find out the restaurants that are nearby you and book a reservation with 3 or 4 clicks on your phone. Or my favorite application is called Taxi Magic. You can basically, again, with a few clicks on your phone, have a taxi pick you up right where you are by dispatching a number of different taxi cabs that are available, and it disappears. It really seems like magic to me. Even Google is involved with this stuff in building an application called Latitude, which allows you to share your location with people that you've already agreed to, your friends group, your family, and you can see where they are too. We think that sharing of the information is incredibly powerful and leads to further applications that we can only imagine at this point. The next part I'd like to discuss is real quickly devices. See, my time is running faster than I thought. I think there's an interesting paradox here. On one hand, you have, because of the cloud computing, a convergence of devices, whether now the phone can be the GPS or navigator, it can also be the music player and the camera. But on the other hand, because of the cloud computing, you have a plethora of new devices, whether it be the tablet or the netbooks. So I think that's an interesting thing that it enables because of this connection to this broadband pipe. So again, I'll leave the rest for the question, but I want to commend the Commission for hosting this workshop, and I wish we had done more of this when I was here. And happy to participate in Google as I can in sharing data and providing tools to inform the inquiry.
Thank you, Sam. Jeremy?
Hi. Thanks. My name's Jeremy Liu. I'm a managing director at Lightspeed Venture Partners. We're a venture capital firm with about $2 billion under management, and I lead our internet and media and gaming consumer-facing investments. Appreciate the opportunity to share some views here today. I think the discussion about what broadband is a good place to start with some comments. I think there are 3 separate elements of broadband that are, I think, important to sort of tease out. Each of them have different implications for usage, and the first is simply the always-onness of broadband. And I think regardless of speed, when you find that your internet connection is always on, you see a meaningful increase in the use of information lookup. And so there's a whole bunch of use cases around that I think are independent of megabits per second or anything else. We've seen that with PCs, and we're increasingly seeing it with mobile devices, and with the iPhone in particular, where you're seeing this instant on constant connection leading to a whole bunch of utility use cases, information lookup use cases, including a bunch of the ones that Sunil mentioned that I think these are new behaviors that are important. The second one is the one that I think is the most time has been spent on, and that is the speeds for the downloads. And I think that they've been discussed at some length, so I won't go into that in any more detail. And then the third one is obviously the speed of upload. That is an area that I think has had less focus for immediate consumption and more for this idea of content creation and sharing. And I think that we're just starting to see the beginning of those use cases emerging over the last couple of years, because as always, whenever you see a new medium, the behaviors that existed in an old medium translate the quickest, and you need a little bit more percolation time before you see some new behaviors emerging. And so similarly with the internet, you saw video consumption, news, sports, and so forth, and commerce, which all had established precedents from the offline world, migrate before some of this more organic content creation that really needed time to bake. The second point that I'd like to address is around the idea of devices, and I think there was a discussion on the early panel about what's the right way to measure broadband. Is it megabits per second or is it time? I come out on the side of time, and I think that's really important from a consumer perspective, because the difference between 50 and 100 megabits per second might be milliseconds or fractions of a second when it comes to serving a web page, and so that's sort of immaterial to a user. One one of the interesting things about the proliferation of mobile devices is that render speed, which is not a significant factor for PCs, becomes quite a significant factor for the time from when a user, say, makes a click and sees a web page served or so forth. And in fact, when we were doing some diligence for one of our investments in a mobile browsing company, we learned that for iPhones, the average time to render a page is about 40 seconds, of which about 8 seconds on, this is an iPhone connected to Wi-Fi. It takes about 40 seconds on average between when you click on a page and when that page completes loading. Only 8 seconds of that is composed of data coming in, and roughly 32 seconds is composed of that processor on that phone trying to show the pictures and the web page that you've looked at. And so even significant increases in bandwidth speed may not in fact meaningfully change the user's perception as to how long things take. So that's an interesting perspective as well. I think the last point that I'd like to make is, as always, and this point was made on the last panel, applications and usage follow the presence of the infrastructure and network. And oftentimes, what you see is relatively frivolous uses of increased bandwidth in the beginning. And again, it takes time for these new applications to percolate. Often a gestation period that's measured in years rather than months or weeks. And so any work that we do to try to improve the broadband infrastructure of this country, I think we have to be willing to accept that there's going to be a period where the use of that infrastructure may be frivolous. It may not be, it may be more entertainment focused than utility focused. And we just need to be prepared for that and prepared to defend against that, because it requires a little bit more time before new mergers, new applications emerge.
Thank you. David?
Great, thanks. I actually had some slides. Are they available?
Yeah,
Oh,
they're
perfect.
loaded and all set.
Thank you. So my name is David C. I run marketing for Cisco's Emerging Technologies Division, which is sort of shorthand for all of the cool new internally developed technologies. So I have a lot of fun, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, in particular, one emerging technology that I think has some very interesting implications for broadband deployment. So if you go to my next slide, Cisco, as you can imagine, does a fair bit to study broadband traffic patterns, and it probably comes as no surprise to anybody that we're seeing tremendous growth in broadband usage globally across the internet. But what's maybe more interesting is if you sort of go down a level from that, and if you could just click to my next slide and look at what's causing the growth. Obviously, there's lots of different applications emerging, but the one that is the primary driver of broadband growth is video, and it's started with peer-to-peer video and probably people bootlegging a few videos here and there, but more and more it's becoming mainstream video content, so video on demand and downloads for entertainment and things like YouTube, etc. But we're seeing a very strong trend towards the growth of video communication as a key driver of bandwidth usage. And we think that that'll be a very powerful future enabler for a variety of different purposes. And so, that's we think a very important part as we look across the broadband initiative to think about the future of video deployment. And if you go to my next slide, we see this not only across the open internet, we also see this across businesses. We see businesses adopting the use of video as a way of essentially virtualizing their employees and using it as a way to, compensate for the globalization of their businesses. And so, not only large businesses have made significant investments in using video as a way to drive, communications and to foster, collaboration across their company, but, they do it across company boundaries, so small companies doing it with their partners and suppliers and customers and whatnot. Cisco has an area that we've invested very heavily in. Many of you have heard about Cisco Telepresence, which essentially is a way to initially virtualize a meeting. And so, if you imagine taking a conference table, like the one pictured here, cutting it in half and moving one half of it 1,000 miles away and connecting the two halves by a network, and if you can click through to the next slide, then you get a sense of what Cisco Telepresence is. And essentially, if you are in a telepresence meeting, we've tried very hard to create a virtual meeting environment where where you feel like you are sitting across the table from somebody just as if they were, within an arm's reach, although they may be separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. If you go to the next slide. So this sort of gives you a sort of more lifelike picture of what telepresence looks like. And we're seeing, if you can sort of just, I have a build, if you can just click through. This is full high-definition video. So people show up in life size on these 65-inch plasma displays. And we've created a sense of immersion by not only combining multiple video channels, but also spatial audio, certain lighting capabilities, et cetera, and the inclusion of data services. So you can share presentations and slides or projected information. And create essentially a virtual meeting between any number of locations anywhere around the globe. If you go to my next slide, sorry, if you can build that one more. Now, you've seen sort of one that comprises a virtual room, but there are a number of other endpoints that are available, so that you can have smaller systems, you can have bigger rooms, and so the bigger rooms would be useful for things like remote education or virtual classrooms. The smaller systems, which could be in a small conference room, in a private office, in a home office, are examples of ways that you can have individuals participating in meetings, and of course these systems can interact with each other. And Cisco's been very public about bringing this all the way into the home with the consumer telepresence effort. So you'll see, Cisco Telepresence and technologies like it creating a breadth of video capabilities that allow you to meet with anybody in the world as if you were there without having to travel. Last slide. Sorry, one more. And so, if you sort of look at how telepresence might, be deployed in a rural community, certainly, there's some easy applications, right? So telecommuting is one, and we actually have a number of examples of that inside of Cisco. It enables small businesses or remote businesses to conduct business globally and meet with customers, partners, or suppliers without being handicapped by their location. It gives businesses access to global expertise, right? You can use telepresence as a way to consult with experts in a particular field. You can imagine a farmer who can use telepresence to actually talk to a farming expert or a grain expert or whatnot. There's an opportunity for businesses to provide a whole range of consumer-to-business services, consulting services, banking services, planning services, and whatnot. Phenomenal opportunity for remote education and actually bringing, the world's best instructors to a virtual classroom, and again, making distance and location not a handicap. And then, there's also obviously a range of applications built around social communication and enabling, people in outlying areas to be part of, global communities, again, without regard to their location. So we think that, this category of technologies is a great opportunity to, help, rural communities feel closer, but without losing their, unique location attributes. And as we look at how broadband plays, this is the kind of application we think should be considered.
Thank you, David. Lauren?
Hi, my name is Laureen Cook. I'm VP of LTE 4G Strategy at Alcatel-Lucent. Thank you very much for including Alcatel-Lucent in today's program. One of the main topics we'd like to talk about regarding applications and device trends is the fact that there is no killer app. Killer app is definitely a misnomer that we have been in search of for years throughout various reiterations of cellular service. As we approach converging services such as LTE and fiber to the home, we see user-generated content and technologies that require mashup components that will be the driving force behind the future of application and device trends in the future. We're currently working and spending a great deal of time at Alcatel-Lucent on emerging technologies, looking at LTE, looking at technology from the consumer's perspective. As there is no one killer application, you need to look at the various segments of the market. And when we look at the marketplace, we see that the consumer generation, or the consumer customer, in particular the millennial generation, is looking for personalization and ubiquity of services, immediacy. From any access point, anywhere, they're looking for a common portal to their data when they want it, where they want it, and how they want it. When we look at the enterprise, the enterprise is looking for increased business productivity tools, and they're looking for reduced computing costs for their employees. When we look at the operators are looking for new potential revenue streams from non-traditional telco sources. As voice is becoming more of a commodity over time, we're seeing that various forms of data stream, high bandwidth, high definition data, hogging revenue streams become more and more a key factor in the proliferation of the operators and their competitiveness going forward. As a manufacturer of telecoms equipment, as one of the largest manufacturers of telecoms equipment in the world in terms of volume, we have a great deal of experience in working within these three segments. In particular, we're focusing on 5 major segments that we think are of significant importance to this panel, which is enterprise and e-healthcare, media and entertainment, automotive connectivity, digital signage, and cloud computing. And what we'd like to do is share some of our insights with our customers and our experiences with the network operators and the end users to help formulate and evolve the industry as it should going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. And at Sprint, I'm responsible for the device development, systems development, and technology development for Sprint. When I walked in today, I heard Julius, that was probably the comment that I heard when Julius was talking about, I don't want to necessarily in the next panel talk more about spectrum, and I think you mentioned net neutrality. And
That was Brian.
well, I appreciate that. And sorry that Brian's going to miss it, but we appreciate you guys inviting us so that we can be enabling how to empower consumers and make broadband what we call as pervasive and affordable. Next slide, please. So if you look at it, Moore's Law has obviously been at its work, and it's driven by consumers' demand for driving innovation. What do you mean by innovation? Initially, the device was all about voice. Voice was indeed the killer app, whatever we say and not, in terms of the previous past. Everyone was looking for how to get the best experience out of voice. But today, it's about the services that you want at your office, the services that you want from a business management, home management, entertainment management, etc. And there is an ecosystem around it, if you will, that is allowing us to create enhanced value and productivity with some improved device capabilities, whether it is enhanced memory, whether it's enhanced UIs, or personalized applications and services. If you look at the next slide, please. The next slide is very important to me because that is a lady, as we all know, by the name of Susan Boyle, who became an icon, actually, of the global world. There was about 20 million hits in 11 days across YouTube. And by the way, Sprint does not discriminate anyone having any applications on our network. And so how did the Boyles of the world become successful? Because Sprint believes in openness. Sprint believes in enabling openness, not just at the network level, not just at the device level, not just at the systems level or the platforms level, but a uniform way of enabling open as a platform for third-party developers to create new, unique applications and services, also allowing the customer who has to be empowered to create their own UI and experience. To me, that is the differentiation. I heard someone talk about broadband. What is broadband? Broadband is defined by the customer, be it an enterprise customer or a typical consumer. Next slide, please. So if you look at, if Susan Boyle was on one edge of that balance, actually, just because of where we are in terms of as a broadband revolution or revolution from the US standpoint, we as the United States in my opinion, should be driving the broadband revolution. Unfortunately, we've been outsmarted by the rest of the world. I had the privilege and the opportunity before I came into Sprint the last 6 years to drive the broadband of a country called India, where broadband was not pervasive, but it's getting to be pervasive because there's over 300 million users, where in 2003 it was 16 million users, just to give you a comparison. Now, number of users is obviously not what I'm talking about. It is that consistent experience that needs to be given so that the Boyles of the world, I describe Boyle as an individual who is what I would say is simply ordinary but amazingly extraordinary. And that amazing extraordinary happened because it was the world of the internet. The internet is as quick as today our speed of thought and the ability for someone to type it in and it is available to the rest of the world. But it to be really pervasive, and the definition of broadband, every single component of that network connectivity have to be successful. Whether you call it first mile, whether you call it middle mile, whether you call it end mile, or whether you call it the mile that is associated with your device, it has to work in synchronization. So it is very important for us as a nation to offer this country and as a leader to the rest of the world that we have applications and services that can change the world, not just when you have sitting under the tower, or not just when you are sitting in particular carriers' data centers. Irrespective of where they are, we want to empower them and make sure that they can use this to enhance their value and productivity.
Thank you. How do you see, on the one hand, clearly it's desirable that people have the freedom to use whatever applications that they want to, for innovators to develop them, and for users to have a good experience. How do you see that affecting, first I'll talk about the business models that exist today. Do you see those as changing with an applications environment where maybe the systems designer can't be sure of what the traffic's going to look like? If you could maybe each just go down the line and comment on that. Sunil?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Julius. I mean, the idea that voice is commoditized, I guess the way you're defining voice and pricing voice today, I guess, is going towards it's diminishing in value per minute. But you can have other ways of generating that revenue. Just my own personal use, I think I peaked in my cell minutes of 12,000 minutes back 4 years ago. I use about 500 minutes now, but my data is through the roof. Now, the pricing plans for these, at least I'm talking the mobile world, they don't change as quickly as our usage changes. So there is a little bit of a lag and gap that occurs there. So I think they will have to, just change their pricing model to reflect the usage, but there's plenty of, the value and utility of that service or that network and that device is increased over those past 5 years. So just looking at it from a per minute pricing and that going to zero does not reflect any kind of dire straits that these carriers are in. It does require them to be more creative in their marketing and figuring out how to price these plans appropriately. There's a point that was made in the earlier panel, I think, starting with the pricing caps or just bandwidth caps. Again, this is a matter of pricing. Why shouldn't the user just use more than be priced accordingly, so they know what they're getting into? So if they're extracting a lot of cost onto the network, they should be paying the same amount or reflected, relatively speaking.
Was your question focused on the business model for the people who are providing broadband or for the people who are providing the apps that sit on top of that broadband?
It's actually for the providers, but if you have any insights on the app side that.
I'm not going to have a lot of insight on the provider's side, but right. I think, for the folks, for the app providers who are building this functionality that will sit on top of the broadband that ultimately consumers are finding the value in, ultimately there's only two business models for those folks. You're either going to get the user to pay you, or you're going to give it away for free and support it with advertising. On the, getting people to pay you side, there's a variety of people who are having some success with that. But I think on the advertising side, one of the earlier questions on the panel was what else in government could affect, this landscape, this universe. And the FTC has been talking a little bit about some privacy work to do with behavioral targeting. Behavioral targeting probably represents 30 to 40% of the revenue for advertising-supported business models today. Probably more for startups, perhaps a little bit less for bigger companies and established media brands. Depending on where some of the proposed policy comes out on, opt-in for opt-in third-party cookies for behavioral targeting. I don't want to get too down in the weeds on it, but there's implications for the ability for startup companies to actually be able to have sufficient revenue from advertising models to be able to provide the sort of services that consumers are looking for.
Good. David, do you ever worry about the traffic getting so heavy that the highway won't carry it?
No.
Can always build more.
Yeah, exactly. I think, one perspective, particularly as we look at, video as a driver of, usage, video is an experiential technology. So, when there are glitches in your video, you see them, right? And if anybody's ever tried to watch a ball game, over the internet, right, and had a, bad connection or a congested connection or whatnot, and, you sort of see the play stop, and then maybe you get a little jitter, and all of a sudden you've missed a key shot, or, everybody's running down the field the other way, you have no idea what happened, understands how the experience relates to the quality of service you get. And, we think that, in general, it's good to have different levels of service, right, that, carriers and providers can charge for to, allow different levels of capability, at different price points. And when we look at things like Cisco Telepresence, we make, heavy use of, capabilities in carrier networks that offer, quality of experience guarantees. They can get packets from one end to the other end, in a reasonably guaranteed way and within certain types of conditions, which allow you to have the kind of robust interactive communication that people want. Now, you could opt not to pay for that level of service, and you might have a, quality of communication that's not as good. And I think, that's where you can let market forces come to play. But, certainly, making sure that there are differing, levels of quality that carriers can offer and not homogenizing everything, we think is an important capability.
Lauren?
Well, as we approach the rollout of LTE, the business models are definitely changing. Voice has become more of a commodity. We have, on a global basis, learned from the mistakes of the past with the rollout of 3G, where there were no devices or applications to fill the pipe. The value here of the ecosystem becomes extremely important in the rollout of high bandwidth products and services going forward. The business models are changing in that there will not be one particular operator or one particular content provider or one particular applications developer who can do it all. We see the value of the ecosystem and the leveraging of various components of the ecosystem as becoming more important in the development of mashup technologies and mashup applications that are required by our consumers. We're already beginning to see collaborative business tools that are utilizing both social networking sites and are utilizing both business applications at the same time. We're seeing machine-to-machine applications with cloud computing, and there will be a lot more of that going forward. So therefore, the value of the ecosystem and understanding that companies need to come together, both on the service provider, infrastructure, applications development, and content development side, and come together to form an ecosystem that will produce these new devices and applications as we're ready to roll out these networks, will make the rollout of these networks far more beneficial and robust to the population at large.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, just to tag from where Lorraine left off, because I believe when we talk about mashup, the real mashup can only be done when the network provider or the service provider is open to allow third-party developers to very easily have access to his assets. So if you look at Sprint, I know a lot of entities have been talking about open quite recently, and cloud computing, and we always get lost what exactly is open and what exactly is this cloud computing. And what happens is I think it's very important to work with the third-party developers. What I mean by that is there's been about 335 open devices on Sprint's network that has got nothing to do with Sprint. And obviously, for us to having certified those 335 devices in a very timely manner, there was a cost and effort associated with it, but we made it easy for them to come in and access our infrastructure. What we see is the open network becoming more like a transaction-based services, if you will. So we expose certain network components, whether you use location-based services, whether you use call control, whether you use messaging, or whether I use the power of the pre as an example, right? How do you expose certain components of the devices, the network, the systems, and all of that collectively forms your open ecosystem from that carrier. And I think it's very important for the carrier to be adaptable to a changing business model and enable new business models. However, for the investments of the carrier, it's important that the application ecosystem is willing to pay that return on investment that is required by the service provider, which I think ultimately is required for any successful business.
Stag?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that, but first, a brief digression. I was disappointed to hear there was no killer app, but it occurred to me if we combine Cisco's Telepresence with Sprint's mobility and offer video telepresence to the driver of cars, we might have our true killer app. But the real follow-up is, a lot of talk about the ecosystem, end-to-end service development. As a policymaker, help me think about that, because when I first started working for Bell Labs, and I will show my age, 1976, one of the first things I was asked, and probably Walter and Rashmi or some of the others in Bell System were, show that if we allow if the FCC is making us let other people hook things to the network, and the network's going to crash and burn, and we were all charged to show why the network would crash and burn if we allowed other things hooked up to the Bell System network, i.e. phones. We all failed. Somebody told me 10 years later they found one incident. But now we're in a network of networks with very complex devices. You told us how important end-to-end performance is, but what does a policymaker think about what is the performance that we worry about? Because we're not going to specify end-to-end performance, and I don't think you want us to. And we aren't going to specify architectures, and I don't think you want us to. So how do we think about the performance and policy in this world of end-to-end experience and networks, et cetera?
So since I generated most of the points from Stag, I think I owe a response to him. And because the definition, in my opinion, from Sprint's standpoint, Sprint has to offer its customers the best experience at the lowest cost structure. Because the customer is looking for, irrespective of the customer be doing business applications or be in the mobile device. To me, the biggest mobile device is your car. So your vehicle, when you're in your vehicle, or whether you're at home, at your office, the ability for Sprint should be to give the most affordable service. However, what's happening is we've got more than 90% of the access, whether you call it special access, whether you call it middle mile, etc., being controlled by very few carriers. That inhibits us in terms of having a level playing field. That inhibits us in enabling the Susan Boyles of the world to be successful in terms of being pervasive, if you will, at the right price point. So where we see help in working with FCC would be, how do we ensure that when we talk about broadband, that the broadband based on each customer's experience or each consumer's experience of Stag's killer app that he talked about, if you really have to make video pervasive without the blurry images that David was referring to, you really need to have that connectivity. that runs across from an end-to-end perspective. Because if, you know, what do they say? Your network is only good as the weakest link. So we can continue to put more bandwidth, but at what cost? Because, you know, ultimately it is our competitors and our peers who have that access, and we will have to figure out a mechanism that enables the consumers in the United States to have the right experience.
And I might just add to that. I agree. I don't think you want to be specifying architecture, and I don't think you want to be specifying end-to-end performance, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't measure it, because that is ultimately going to be the predictor of what sort of apps and what sort of user experiences you're getting at the end of the day.
Stag, to your point, the end-to-end development you talk about, I think you don't have to reiterate the rest of the panel here, set any standards or set any kind of minimum thresholds, but it is tied to competition policy too. So to the extent that the OEM and device manufacturing sector is competitive, to the extent that the carrier sector is competitive, they will set what the consumers ultimately want and desire, and that will drive the innovation there.
So,
At the end of the day, the customer just wants ubiquitous service, be it from fiber to the home or via LTE. They don't care. All they know is at their touch point, at that point in time, they want to be able to be offered a consistent user experience. End of story.
I think they'd even trade off consistency just for the user experience.
No, I concur with that. Again, just as a short extension to what Lorraine's saying, whether you call LTE, ultimately that LTE has to have a backhaul. That LTE need to have some wired connectivity, because the content necessarily is not sitting in a data center that has got all these LTE backhauls. It is connected on very high, whether you call it DWDM or not to get into the technology, but big fat pipes. So if we have to be successful, whether it is LTE, whether it is WiMAX, irrespective of technology from a 4G standpoint, and make broadband pervasive, we have to break the connectivity bottleneck.
let me try to get you all to be more specific, because we're still at the platitude level, folks. What is the one thing you would recommend policymakers do, given the problems you see out there?
I'll take a stab at that. One thing that I mentioned before, to be very specific, maybe too specific, is perhaps look at spectrum reform within the commission and look at ways you could open up existing spectrum for the backhaul problem. One example is cars band frequency. Look at ways you can open up the eligibility and restriction usage to allow cars band providers to use it as backhaul in rural areas and high-cost areas. These technologies already exist. The cable guys have been using this for many years. They've been using it less because they've been moving into terrestrial fiber networks. And so you have a plethora of, of spectrum available out there, pretty good chunks. And my last recall is only an application interference test that people need to file to get it. That's one example of dealing with the backhaul issue.
Good, thank you.
Don't forget to file on the proceeding we just started today.
Another comment I would make is, I think we're sort of getting hung up on this idea that it needs to be a certain, speed, a certain megabits per second, and that requires policy or technical solutions to that. As I said before, I think just the always-onness is actually more important than any particular level of speed. And, there are still parts of America where it's actually hard to get any broadband connection, and I would go after that problem before before trying to set some sort of minimum standard for speed that has to be nationwide.
Again, not to harp on the point, and I will come down to the ground reality. The ground reality is, I think, we need some sort of regulatory framework that gives us a level playing field. And in the special access specifically. And with respect to, I've heard about the spectrum story, and I agree, Sunil, we need spectrum, as much spectrum as we can get. However, I don't want any one of us to take the notion that spectrum is going to fix backhaul, because they are two separate issues. Remember, RAN capacity is the capacity between your mobile device and your mobile station, whether you call it a BTS, a BSC, MSC, whatever it is. Now there is a backhaul capacity which is much bigger than your multiple carriers or spectrum/RAN that is required, which is a separate problem. So I would like to separate the two issues as two distinct issues that need to be addressed, because addressing one does not solve the pervasiveness of broadband at affordable costs, so that we are not laggards but leaders in the broadband space as we look at our emerging broadband business.
Just to add to your point, I would love to see us view broadband connectivity as a fundamental element of our country's competitiveness on a global basis. And, you know, if you look at where we stack up in broadband deployment versus other countries, it's shockingly low. I mean, considering what, you know, economic and political, et cetera, power we are for us to be such laggards in broadband deployment. And I think, you know, we should be looking at it as fundamental to our competitiveness globally, and we should seek to lead in connectivity and, you know, treat it as a way that will help power the innovation of our economy. And anything short of that, I think, is
Let me follow up on that, because I hear
Sure.
you and Jeremy saying two different things. Right. Currently, somewhere around 7% of the country does not have broadband access other than by satellite. That's not a big swing in the addressable market in the U.S. So are you saying the real problem is the broadband we have is not good enough? Or is it an adoption problem, that it's those 40% who aren't taking broadband, we've got to convince them to take it? Or, so are you saying we need to
Sure.
improve the broadband that's out there, we need to get more people adopted, or we need to get the unserved served?
I would say yes.
But prioritize.
I think, you know, having a better broadband infrastructure that enables, you know, higher speeds at lower costs for, you know, as much of the population as we can manage would be our number one priority. And, you know, if I look at, you know, like my home use, I think I have 20 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second up, which is pretty good.
Where do you live?
I live in Walnut Creek, California, and I am the envy of most of the people I meet who can't get anything even close. But, you know, if you look at me compared to somebody who lives, and I know there was a discussion around South Korea earlier, but if, you know, if I lived in South Korea, I'd be able to get a whole lot more for a whole lot less, right? And so, you know, what would I do with that bandwidth? To be honest, I'm not completely sure, but
I think that's the point, though, right?
no, but my point, though, is that if you have it, right, and it is available at some price, that, you know, that helps spark innovation, right? Because, you know, you've got startups out there who say, boy, what a great idea, except, you know, our addressable market's like, you know, 0.5% of the U.S. based on the bandwidth or the quality of service that this, you know, that this application needs.
But they actually aren't saying that. They're not saying, you know, if only there were more high-speed connections, we could build a business. Because, I mean, startups and things like that don't stay in business for very long. They say, what's the biggest market I can address today, and what service can I provide to them? And I think, you know, to answer the question that Stag posed, I would take a different perspective, which is, I think there's an equity argument that says that, you know, the 7% of people who don't have access to any sort of broadband at all need to get that at any speed. We shouldn't wait for some, you know, 20 megabit, you know, standard before we roll something out. We should get something to them right away, because just having that always on access changes their usage. And then secondly, there are an awful lot of people who have access to broadband that don't take advantage of that access. And a large part, it's because, like video, it's experiential. Until you try it, you don't know what you're missing. It's really hard for someone who hasn't experienced broadband access to imagine what they're going to use it for. And that's where this idea of kind of frivolous and trivial uses are always the first use of any new technology, broadband included. And we just need to get comfortable with that. So, you know, a good parallel is one laptop per child, which was roundly criticized at one stage because, you know, people were saying, look, you're giving all these laptops to all these, you know, underprivileged kids, and they're just using them to play games. Is that actually what we wanted to achieve? And obviously that's not the end game. But once you start them using a computer, even if it's to play games, that sets a baseline from which they can start learning and discovering a whole bunch of applications in addition to that. And I think broadband has a lot of parallels to that. So you have to accept that there will be frivolous usage, and you have to even be prepared to encourage it for people who have the ability to access it but have chosen not to yet.
But to Jeremy's point, I mean, it may be perceived as frivolous usage in the beginning, but that does change over time, and we've already begun to see that. We take a look at gaming. We take a look at social networking and logistic-based services. There are whole economies that are being born from the internet that were never possible before because of these quote-unquote frivolous services that people were playing with. E-commerce is now being generated over social network sites such as Facebook. So by expanding the internet and by expanding broadband access to all people, it gives them the opportunity to build and develop. And again, to Jeremy's point, it may be a bit frivolous in the beginning, but that does spawn on further technological development and applications and devices in the future.
Sorry.
It's like, I guess, in terms of how you prioritize your policy issues, really depends on how much you believe it is a supply issue or is it a demand issue. And Jeremy made this point earlier about the demand part. You may have all this broadband out there and everyone has 3G or even 4G, but there are other factors that affect people's usage of things. For example, Jeremy pointed out that the processing power on the device, as somehow a bigger cause of the delay. Just because you have the bigger pipes out there, bigger spectrum out there, does not necessarily result in a commensurate increase in demand. And one example I can share with you from Google is that the bigger driver for our usage in mobile devices was flat rate data pricing, not the bandwidth. The Metro PCS introduced flat rate data pricing, $5 a month. They 5 times more Google searches than some of their competitors who are much larger, and they're also on a 2.5G CDMA network. Again, the pricing plan and the economics around that affect the demand much greater than necessarily the throughput. Of course, maybe if we get into what this commission's jurisdiction and where the coverage is, and this is, of course, a broadband task force, maybe focus on the supply part, but I think you should also take into account the demand piece here, that there's a number of applications that are very compelling, that are very useful, that have nothing to do, there's enough throughput out there today. It's not to diminish the fact that we shouldn't, that we should be proud of where we are in the rankings in the world. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just suggesting the demand piece is much more nuanced and it has more to do with economics and pricing than throughput.
So just to add to Sunil, I think pricing is very important, but for one to provide the right price structure, you need to have the right cost structure. Because when you're just the application creator, you don't necessarily always understand the cost of infrastructure that the infrastructure players have to go through to create that infrastructure. So it is critical to understand the cost structure in providing that infrastructure. But I also, Jeremy, to your point, I think we as a nation owe it to that 7% of the people, which is why those spectrums out there is very important in meeting certain segments of the society from a pervasiveness. But also, we want to make sure that broadband is enhanced at an affordable price because we are in a digital economy, not a US-centric economy, but the digital global-centric economy. We've been talking about healthcare reforms here. I mean, pretty extensively the last few weeks with all these town hall meetings. Could we disrupt the way, he talked about telepresence. Could we disrupt the way healthcare is done in this country? And I think we have opportunities to do that as well, and broadband could be that big catalyst.
One more question, and then I'll shut up for a while. Building on what you just said, and what Jeremy said about the unserved, if we follow the normal rollout path for 4G, we'll get 4G to rural areas about 2020. Suppose we could magically do something and get 4G out there starting from the rural areas inwards in the next 2 to 3 years. Would that meet the need for broadband connectivity to homes and businesses? Would that really move the needle on things?
You would have to find a way to make that cost effective for the operators to roll that out, and that's where the challenge comes in.
What do we need to do that?
I think I've said it once, I'll say it again, but I think that's a critical component. I think, Stag, I'm glad you brought that up because we have to not do the ordinary. We have to do the extraordinary. Because if we continue to follow incremental steps of saying, I would get 4G there in 2020, I think we have missed the whole journey. If we have to do 4G in 2015 or 2012 or 2013 should be our strategy. And to do that, we have to bring in certain regulations in certain areas. And not to say that we want a fully regulated service in every area. We just need to make sure that there is fair and competitiveness so that it goes back to Laureen's point of affordability is very key to that as well. So that there is a business model and not what we saw in 2000 and 2001, where we created a bubble and realized that there was no business model to justify that. And I'm sure the policies that you want to make, enhances the possibility of a sound business model, if you will.
I think it would be terrific to have 4G starting in the rural areas, but I'm not sure that it's necessary. And David says he has 20 megabit downstream speeds, and I would say, David, why do you pay for 20 megabit downstream speeds? And he'll probably say, because I had 3 before and it wasn't enough. And why'd you get 3? Because I had 1 and it wasn't enough. And why'd you get 1? Because it was 500K and it wasn't enough. You've got to start with some level of access to stimulate the demand for more. Otherwise you have this problem of it being uneconomic for folks to roll out at the latest.
Well, I was really trying to, in some sense, ask the question, would it be sufficient in rural areas to quickly deploy, call it 3.5G?
3, 2, edge, fine, whatever. Just give people instant on access, and they'll start using the internet for things they didn't use before. They'll start looking up phone numbers instead of pulling out the yellow pages. They'll start checking the menu before they get in the car. They'll check the movie times, and they'll say, gee, it'd be great to be able to see that trailer before I get in the car, although I know what time it is, and I need a faster connection. And they'll call their operator, and they'll be willing to pay for it. And then they'll say, geez, if I didn't have to get in the car at all, I could just watch it on, sitting at home. I need a faster connection than that. And that's how it goes.
And Jeremy, I agree with you, but I do have a slightly different view as well, because Stag, I think having had the privilege, like I said, of being in a different place at a different period of time to see where they missed on the 2G, certain countries missed the entire 2G. If they tried to offer the same 2G, I would have been very disappointed, but they did 3G and beyond. So I think we as a nation should not be disappointed in offering, not that we shouldn't offer them the trickles of the speed or connectivity, please don't get me wrong. I think we really need to take care of our 7%, which is critical. But at the same time, if there is an opportunity for us to give them the big bandwidth, because healthcare in itself could be a great application that the rural community can have without driving 100 miles to find the nearest doctor, which is even common within the United States, whether we accept it or not. So
Yeah, I'm not saying not to give it to them. I'm
No,
just
no, I hear
saying
you.
that,
Absolutely.
I would not wait until 4G
Totally
was
agree.
the only option. I would say, what's the fastest and cheapest way? And if it's even a relatively small pipe, better than nothing and better than waiting.
But 4G LTE is being deployed as we speak right now. So one could argue that that probably is the fastest time to market with the biggest pipe that they could get in the most economic format. And applications like e-healthcare and like e-learning, which are huge initiatives here in the United States, they're very viable right now over the LTE 4G networks as we speak. We're running applications that are, again, mashup applications with leveraging the partners in our ecosystem right now around e-health, around telemedicine, around e-surgical suites as well. So that will help fill that gap as well. So you might as well, if you're going to roll out broadband to that 7%, you might as well give them the biggest pipe possible.
I don't have a dog in the technology choice right here. All I'm saying is we shouldn't say we've got to provide something that provides telepresence healthcare or it's not worth doing. There's plenty that's worth doing before that point.
Well, this is a great opportunity with the examples that are raised. I think one of the questions you asked, Stag, what should we do? Well, you as the FCC perhaps should coordinate activity with Department of Health, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, because all these different agencies are going through massive upgrades, whether it be the smart grids or construction programs and new roads and healthcare reform. They all have a broadband nexus to it. So if one specific activity could be how to coordinate better with these agencies to, instead of viewing broadband as a sole individual industry, it's a complement to enable or empower those other efforts.
Let me give a chance to Allison and James. Either one.
I'll go first, I guess. When you were talking about a lot of mobile applications, you tend to talk about very low bandwidth things, the augmented reality, or calling a taxi cab, getting a menu, getting show times. When you talk about wired type access, you talk about telepresence and a lot of machine-to-machine communications that uses a lot more bandwidth. Is this merely a side effect of the bandwidths that are available today, or is that actually something that even going on into the future, the mobile applications tend to be the lower bandwidth type of applications?
I mean, the biggest thing is openness principles, right? That enabled, if you look at what the iPhone did, it's like it wasn't just the bandwidth, there's also the brilliant design and the UI and everything that combined together. And the openness idea that your third-party, the 65,000 apps are by third-party developers on the iPhone. So again, it goes, what was mentioned earlier, no matter how smart any one agency or a company think they are, it's incredible what people come up with. So there's no killer app per se that one's going to be a silver bullet, to Lorraine's point, but there are so many out there that are very interesting that no one could have imagined. Have you guys seen the USAA automatic check depositing app? It takes a picture, you take a picture of your check with your iPhone, and it deposits it automatically in your checking account. I mean, that's just amazing, you know? This wasn't a mom and pop, this was a bank that came up with it. But, you know, this is just, it reduces a tremendous amount of friction, and it's incredibly efficient. It's just, I mean, those are the kind of things you see. Now, that may require some kind of bandwidth, some kind of optical recognition, some technology in there, but I'm just saying, just focusing on the bandwidth piece of it is not providing the complete picture.
Yeah, but just to add, this is very interesting again, because we know of so many different carriers that have restricted applications and services running. These are the nation's largest carriers. Why have they restricted if bandwidth is not an issue? That's a question that I would pose. If bandwidth is not an issue and bandwidth is affordable, I cannot fathom why it is an issue. Also, everyone talks about iPhone and the 65,000 applications and the 1.5 billion downloads very liberally. How many times have we seen the pain the customers are going through of not able to have the right experience on those applications and those carriers? Are we reading only one side of the picture? Should we not read the other side as well?
Well, as we approach LTE and its deployment, that sort of goes away, because we do have the bandwidth and we do have the low latency. So those issues that were roadblocks before for high-definition video hogging applications and devices now become irrelevant. There's more of a blurring, as we see, between fixed and wireless. And as I have said earlier, the user experience must be close to ubiquitous regardless what the touch point is. In the LTE environment, video becomes a huge component of that which will touch all the different verticals within LTE. Video for video gaming, downloading high-definition music, high-definition video streams, but also as it relates to things such as new avenues and new revenue streams, such as digital signage. Digital signage opens up a whole new medium, which was never, ever possible before in a 3G environment. Now that you'll be able to deploy and differentiate content at the drop of a hat over the network, we'll be able to get even public service announcements out to rural places before that never could have access to some very critical pieces of content, either from an advertising perspective or from a public service perspective. Digital signage is a great example because it also leads to the prospective sales in e-commerce and access to the internet. It utilizes new applications and new devices that we've never looked at before. We talk about the connected car. The car becomes your real mobile device. And in that device, all kinds of applications can be layered into there. Devices, all kinds of services can be layered into there to help stimulate e-commerce, again, public service, gaming, entertainment, e-health, home monitoring, smart grid technology, smart home technology applications. All are possible as we go into the LTE environment with a low bandwidth and a high bandwidth and low latency issues.
To specifically answer your question, the reason that there aren't a lot of high bandwidth applications for mobile is because there isn't high bandwidth, so companies that are relying on it go away. So that will come. It will come as
It will
as the
come. Open the
bandwidth
pipes
comes.
and they will come.
So do you think there are things sitting there that would be killer apps, great apps, that people decide, well, I can't do this now because the speed isn't there?
Yes.
Digital signage, classic example.
I would say a little more than that. Anything that you do in your home, on your desktop. My kids play Xbox left and right. Could you
Mine too.
actually do that on your mobile device effectively and efficiently and affordably? I think no. So I think there are numerous applications that one can think of. And the experience, irrespective of the screen, would you not want to have the same experience? I know we keep saying bandwidth is maybe not necessarily a bottleneck. I think it's a huge bottleneck in terms of, again, don't get me wrong, it's not just bandwidth. It is the processing associated with it, the memory associated with it, the call functions and how that is utilized at different levels, whether it's device, network, system. So there's a various components on it, but it is a critical component in that process.
I take your points, and let me have James, he had a question too.
Yeah,
And then I'm going, I had questions coming in, and they're great questions, so I want to try to get to these too. So
Well,
go
we've
ahead.
talked a lot about the openness and, kind of vehicles to get where we're headed. Talked about the benefits of having, the access to multiple networks on a device, a lot of the benefits of a flexible platform, of a flexible, device in effect. And what kind of, we've talked a little bit about some of the business or development kind of considerations that go into enabling that. But if we drill down a little bit more into that, there's a lot of intellectual property considerations that maybe people have to deal with. Talking a little bit more about, we've talked a little bit about the pricing side. On the development side, are the tools available today, or is it everyone's expectation that they'll just naturally evolve in the current context to provide for these features? For example, cybersecurity aspects, is it sufficient for all e-commerce applications? And telehealth, they're going to have different considerations maybe than social networking, which also have privacy issues, but might maybe have a different kind of take on that. So maybe if we could drill down a little bit, either on the development or the business side of, how that openness actually comes into play. And Jeremy, you talked a little bit about that as well, so.
Yeah, on the development side, I have no doubt that if there are opportunities to make money, the companies will start to address those opportunities, and I'll fund them. So I don't think that that's something that you need to worry about too much. On the sort of on the privacy, security stuff, I think those are areas that if the industry isn't self-regulating, then I think there's absolutely a role for government to put some sort of set of guidelines or minimum levels. And I think that's something that is appropriate.
I concur with Jeremy. I think market forces will take care of itself, and when you provide the kind of right infrastructure, you'll enable a range of innovation, and the nature of that innovation will solve the critical problems, whether it be security or privacy, et cetera, as part of that innovation process.
Security is an issue. However, market forces will definitely prevail. When we take a look at social networking applications, which are probably those that are the most vulnerable right now, most of them going forward are all opt-in. So if you choose to opt in, it's a risk and a reward, right? That's something that the consumer decides himself. So I think what we need to do as an industry is take a look at where we are and define what is really important along security lines. However, opt-in, which is the case with most of the applications going forward, pretty much is self-regulated.
You're looking.
Yes, and I think security and privacy has always been an issue. It's been an issue even from the Carter phone decision. So, but the same risks that bring along with new technologies, there's plenty of rewards, and in the industry and the government, careful watch, they'll solve those issues, I think.
Let me get to some of these questions that have been coming in. Some of them we've touched on indirectly, but I think there's a little different slant to this. First one, should ISPs be allowed to prioritize traffic to ensure that advanced applications work? Should application providers and/or advertisers be allowed to pay the ISP for higher quality of service so as to enable consumers to enjoy their content? Jeremy, you want to take a stab at that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's how markets work, right? It's, yeah,
So-
absolutely.
So you'd support that? Sunil?
I would just add that, our belief is the non-discriminatory treatment of traffic. So, if you're going to, if a subscriber pays for a platinum package in cable, anyone can also pay for that and get those same channels. Same way, I think that the main point that we'd want to add to that, or wrinkle, the very important one, is that the non-discriminatory aspect to it.
So you would disagree? In other words, the application provider or the advertiser could not pay the service provider to make sure theirs went through faster or with a better quality?
You shouldn't discriminate among the traffic from the origination, or if it's a peer-to-peer or video traffic versus, a peer-to-peer music traffic. I think that's going down a wrong path. It goes against the principles of openness. But if you were to tier based on the service of your consumption of bandwidth, I think that's appropriate, because as your costs are directly related to revenue, and I think the operator should be allowed to recover costs related to revenue related to cost, that is. But discriminating based on packets, I think that just leads to a number of abuses that can only curb innovation. Part of the benefits that we're seeing on the iPhone is exactly, or even just the mobile web right now, or BlackBerry app, or Android, is the fact that it's been robust and open. And once you start to discriminate based on that, the application developers who are going to pay the most can then only get access to the users. That's just going down a path where the development cost becomes so high, then it becomes who has the best interest. At the end of the day, the big companies will figure that out. But I mentioned so many applications today that have nothing to do with Google. These are just small apps, 3 or 4 person shops that come up with these crazy, interesting ideas that I think everyone benefits from.
Yeah, just as
Well,
an
wait a minute,
operator, I think I agree with Sunil that we shouldn't be differentiating traffic. However, I think it's also, one point that he alluded to, I think is very important for us to understand this. There has to be a plan that allows the user to consume, whether it's X amount of traffic. And once he is in that plan, it's for the consumer's choice to see what he wants to do. And it is not necessarily in the best interest to have that traffic being tinkered anywhere along the path. But I would again highlight, it is also important that that application does not hamper the network, because everyone keeps talking about security. I know we talked about a one instance case. It's kind of like an insurance policy, right? Today at Sprint, whether you call it Google Voice, whether you call it Skype, you call it whatever you want, we at Sprint don't mess with anybody's traffic. We allow all kinds of traffic. However, we have certain terms and conditions, just like we drive on the highway. You can do whatever you want, but there are within certain rules. So we don't tinker with it, but we still believe that there has to be a business model, and the customer has to adhere to the business model, not managing the profile of the traffic.
Actually, I
Laurie?
would definitely agree with both Matthew and Sunil on that. Non-discrimination unless the customer opts for it. We take a look at a 3G service provider right now in the UK, Blake. Their whole business model is built around advertising. However, when the customer subscribes to their service, they know that that's part of the deal because they're getting next to free airtime. So as long as the customer is aware and he opts in and agrees to the service terms and conditions, that's fine.
That was the question, right? Is
Right.
that should you be able to discriminate based on the price that a customer pays?
Yeah, I think it was also, though, from the sending end, too, but I don't think we have to dwell on it anymore.
I would hate to see anything, there are going to be applications where the quality of the experience will be determined by the network. And so I'd hate to see anything that prohibited the ability to use the network in a particular way to provide a higher quality of experience.
Okay. Another question. Do the panelists agree or disagree with the premise that the nation's network backbone must be fiber? If so, how far out must the fiber reach? To the home or to intermediate points? Anybody want to take a try at that?
I think from a policy goals, we should try to get it to the home as far as we can.
More is better.
Yeah.
More is better.
I think I'm of the same opinion. More is absolutely better, but we need to make sure that the affordability factor is also taken into account in that context. Because without affordability, you want someone to be willing to pay for, and there has to be a business model around anything that we're trying to do.
Absolutely. More is better, but at what price?
Yes, I think more is better. So that means if you can get the fiber inside the home as well for the right cost structure, yes. I mean, that was, I think, the general consensus of the panel.
The earlier panel, though, talked about fiber-fed wireless. Maybe wireless is good enough if the fiber's close enough.
It's again, so that's another can of worms. Sorry, go ahead.
From a policy objective, I think is the goal, but you may not get there, you're not going to get there right away, but just in terms of encouraging the deployment of fiber as far down into the network as possible should be objective. I think that you'll never, not never, but it'll take several years in which complementary technologies will close that endpoint.
So, in fact, that's exactly what I was trying to just add to what Sunil's saying is, at the end, it's spectral efficiency. How many bits can you pump in within a certain amount of spectrum? I don't know that, or rather, I don't believe that right now we have a luxury of having too much spectrum as well. So I think in the near term, based on technology and science for the near term, as well as the available spectrum, we will have to have wireline technology embedded with wireless technology. It's not necessarily one versus the other, which is why it is paramount that we need to have this end-to-end relationship up and working. It's not just one piece or the other.
I would observe we have a 750 gigahertz, no, I'm sorry, 750 megahertz
I was
pipe.
wondering what you were.
Yeah. It's a fact.
this a millimeter wave
Among
system?
engineering friends, Julie. We do have a 750 megahertz clean pipe passing 90% of the homes in the country called coax. Is that enough?
It's definitely a start, which is why DOCSIS 3.0 and beyond has happened. I mean, we have seen anywhere from 150 megabits to 250 megabits, happening on a 6 megahertz off that channel within DOCSIS of cables have, as part of the digital cable from a last mile standpoint. However, I don't think that is enough. And I haven't seen it to be economical enough. So let me just add that as well. It's not just a question of speed at that point, it's a question of cost and viability as well.
We keep going back to wireline and wireless or complementary services and cost effectiveness, and they're the two issues that need to be looked at.
Does the expanded deployment of fiber help wireless deployment for backhaul? I mean, how critical is it for that in this issue we were talking about before for rural coverage? I mean, if you got the fiber out to the small town and then, so how important is that? How much of a help is this?
I think it's a huge help.
Huge.
I think it's a huge help. We just need to make sure it is given to the right guys so that we can, the rest of the general public have access to it at the right price.
You've got to
So I
look
think
at
it's
the
a
total
huge one.
picture, yeah.
David, this more directly, I've had the opportunity to come over to Cisco's facility in Washington and participate in a video conference worldwide, and it's terrific. Can you say a little bit more about what the company's experience has been and how extensively this is being deployed and what you think are the realistic visions for how it might change back business practices?
Sure. So some, relatively interesting statistics. I mean, first of all, one thing we've learned is that there is a sort of a tipping point in usage of video when you get sort of the right formula. So if you look at, for example, the typical deployment of video conferencing, so traditional video, even high-def video conferencing, by the way, in most organizations, their utilization is usually less than, for 90%, it's less than an hour per day per system. And in fact, in many organizations, and you can all check inside your own organizations, it's less than 20 minutes per day per endpoint, which is not a whole lot. Across people who use telepresence, and it's not just Cisco Telepresence systems, our competitors have the same data. Most telepresence endpoints get 4, 5, 6+ hours of usage per day per endpoint across their entire system of endpoints. So you're seeing a sort of several order of magnitude increase in usage, and it's because I think we created we've reached a tipping point in the quality of experience where the immersive qualities of the interaction make it useful for a much broader set of applications than you would with, other types of video technologies. Today there are, roughly about 1,000 companies around the planet that have, reasonable deployments of telepresence. But even in a, global economic downturn, the telepresence market is growing at well over 100% year over year. So we're seeing a, tremendous growth as companies look at this as a way of, reducing air travel and improving internal efficiency. And globalizing their operations in a productive way. And I was actually thinking as I was coming up here that the next time I come, I would like to visit via telepresence. And you can just put a monitor right here. You can beam me in via telepresence. I'll do this. I'll do this from my office. And you wouldn't lose anything because me being here in person wouldn't add anything versus me being here via telepresence. And I would invite all of my fellow panelists to attend via telepresence as well.
That's
Nevertheless, we appreciated you coming, though.
Right.
to make that pervasive from a phone standpoint or from a connected car, I think that is an outstanding application to have telepresence across the screens and across various domains of your blended lifestyle.
And, just as a aside to this, telepresence has applications beyond meetings or beyond, social purposes. Cisco, for example, have done a number of trials of something we call health presence, which is actually a telepresence-enabled, video medical kiosk, which is designed for rural communities. And we did a very successful pilot with the National Health Service of Scotland, where they did exactly that. And we showed some phenomenal results in the improvement of quality of care, accessibility of care in rural communities that had no doctor service whatsoever, and were able to go to their neighbor, their local health presence system and meet with the type of doctor, whether it's a GP or specialist that could help treat their conditions, and it was incredibly effective.
As we come to the close, I mean, one of the takeaways, at least for me, and tell me if I have it right or off base, you seem to be supporting, first of all, that everybody should have at least some level of access, however it's defined. Jeremy, I didn't hear you say a baseline. Your assertion is, we'll just get them connected, and they'll want more and more, and that'll drive the market. And also suggesting that there might be tiered levels of service. So not everybody necessarily is going to need the robustness for a telepresence, but they would pay for different levels of service and tiers. Is that what I've been hearing?
Yeah.
And keep it open? Is that kind of the?
And accept some level of frivolity in the uses.
Accept
and,
frivolity.
And that's both I think that's sort of one of the things that you need to sort of be prepared for from a public relations perspective as well, because you're going to get a lot of, frivolous
Actually, I
usage.
thought Sunil had an interesting point about, whether we can tie together, other initiatives to sort of help on the demand side for broadband, right? Because, we can make the business model more effective for the service providers, if this is attached not just to a broadband deployment initiative, but it's tied to a smart grid or energy initiative and a health initiative, et cetera. And to the extent that, you can coordinate policy on that and help, create incremental demand, I think that would actually be a phenomenal achievement.
I think this is exactly the
That would
tension.
help stimulate.
I think this is exactly the tension because these are such noble enterprises, and you can talk about telehealth, and you can talk about smart grid, and these are things that everybody can believe in and get behind. And you switch it on, and people are going to start playing games, and you'll be like, "Whoa,
No, they'll do both.
Where's my telepresence?"
They'll multitask.
They will
There you go.
eventually get to these things, but
Yeah.
they won't happen right away, and you've got to prepare
Right.
for that lag.
See, when Jeremy talked about the $100 laptops, right? I mean, for kids to play with, that is the starting point. But we, as the policy makers, from an FCC standpoint, stimulating the economy from a healthcare, energy, and education has core fundamental building blocks for making, and where broadband is an enabler layer. I think it's phenomenal, and for us to be the leader in that space, I think there is a great opportunity in front of us today with the 4G entry path. Just again, making sure that the wireless and the wireline component, and I will reiterate that, are complementary. One cannot necessarily replace that in the near term. So we need to make sure that the wireline processes and the policies are complementing the wireless policies and processes.
Can I give a homework assignment to this group then?
Do we get graded?
Yeah. They probably want me to cut it off right now, Stan. Go ahead.
Jeremy, you've got the bankroll. Google, you've got the information. Cisco, you make pretty cool devices nowadays. You got into the consumer market. Alcatel-Lucent, you're in the network market, and you've got the network. Design an emergency pendant that we can all wear, that when we're in trouble, it's going to either call the police, the fireman, or the doctor.
Over LTE, it already exists.
Now that my homework's
Okay,
done.
so-
All right.
So what does the government have to do so that everybody has one of these? We're wearing it, it's cost effective.
It's part of the ecosystem of LTE.
Tax credit?
Okay. Those are the type of ideas, that's the homework, come back and say, okay, we can have, how do we, you're saying the piece parts are there,
Yeah.
but how do we get it out there so that we're all benefiting from that?
Yeah, from an end-to-end standpoint.
Yeah.
We're
and then-
working very closely as Alcatel-Lucent in that ecosystem to help bring these new services and devices to the forefront of launch of LTE as we speak. So issues around smart metering, e-learning, e-healthcare, it's all there. It's just a matter of having economies of scale, rolling out the networks, and getting it out there.
I was thinking that, we've had cash for clunkers, and I was reading this morning that there'll be cash for appliances. And so maybe the FCC could help lead cash for communications as sort of the next initiative.
Well, I can't close on a better note than that.
Trading your dial-up modem for broadband. How about that?
I want to thank all of our panelists, and it's been terrific, and we're still in the early stages of this process, so we'll probably be back to talk to you some more, but thanks for your contributions. You've been a great panel.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.